She had 3 seconds to decide who she was going to be. Not the woman in the apron. Not the woman who had spent 18 months perfecting the art of being invisible in a room full of powerful men. Not the woman who had learned to make her face empty and her hands still, while million-dollar deals were made around her as though she were furniture. 3 seconds. The document was in her face. The room was watching. And the man in the blue suit, the one with the jaw and the contempt and the $400 million empire, and the interpreter who had just mysteriously walked out, was smiling. "If you're so smart," Dominic Hartwell said, loud enough for every table in the Kaiserhof's private dining room to hear, then translate it. The silence that followed was the kind that is weight, the kind that presses down on everyone in the room except the person who created it. 6 men in suits, an elderly Austrian in a traditional jacket, waitstaff frozen near the walls. All of them watching the waitress with the braided blonde hair and the brown uniform and the water pitcher she had just set down on the table like she was setting down something much heavier. She took the document. She read it. And everything changed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand what happened in that dining room on a Thursday evening in April, you have to understand what kind of woman Sophia Brennan actually was, and why the most dangerous thing Dominic Hartwell ever did was assume he already knew. Part 1. The Woman in the Apron. Sophia had not always poured water for other people's meetings. 29 months ago, she had sat on the other side of tables like this one. She had been the youngest associate at Mueller and Strauss, one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in Central Europe, drafting the exact kinds of contracts that men like Dominic Hartwell signed without reading. She had graduated summa cum laude from the University of Vienna with a dual degree in international law and linguistics. She spoke 6 languages fluently: German, English, French, Mandarin, Italian, and Russian, and 2 more at a level that was, at minimum, humiliating to monoglots. She had clerked for a federal judge at 23. She had authored a legal memo at 25 that the senior partners at her firm called the most thorough piece of contract analysis they had seen in a decade. She had been, by every measurable standard, on her way to becoming something formidable. And then her mother had gotten sick. The kind of sick that doesn't negotiate. The kind that arrives on a Tuesday in October with a diagnosis and a timeline and a medical bill that begins quietly dismantling everything you have built, one direct debit at a time. Sophia had taken leave from the firm. The leave had extended. The bills had not. She had done what people do when pride finally meets necessity. She had found work. The Kaiserhof paid well for someone with language skills. The evening shifts let her care for her mother in the mornings. She had told herself it was temporary. Temporary had lasted 18 months, and in those 18 months, Sophia Brennan had become extraordinarily good at something she had never planned to be good at. Disappearing, not literally. She was there every night, moving between tables, refilling glasses, speaking only when spoken to and often not even then. But she had learned the particular alchemy of service invisibility, how to make herself into an extension of the room's function rather than a person in it, how to be present without being seen. The men who came to the Kaiserhof's private dining room were the kind who conducted sensitive negotiations over dinner because they felt safe there. They passed documents across white tablecloths. They spoke freely. They made decisions worth millions in the casual confidence of people who have never once considered that the woman pouring their Gruner Veltliner might also understand every word. Sophia had never corrected them. She had watched. She had listened. She had carried 17 months of other people's secrets in her head, along with her mother's medication schedule, and the quarterly installment on her student loan, and the memory of who she used to be. And she had done it with the particular brand of quiet endurance that looks, from the outside, like acceptance, but is actually something much more dangerous. It is patience, And patience, properly held, is just power waiting for the right moment. Thursday evening was the right moment, though she hadn't known it yet when she walked into the Kaiserhof at 5:45 in her clean uniform with her hair braided back and her feet already aching from the previous shift. Part 2. The Man in the Blue Suit. Dominic Hartwell had built his empire on the ability to read a room. He knew within 30 seconds of walking into any space which person held the real power, which relationships were strained, which alliances were performing and which were genuine. It was his gift, his edge, the thing that had taken a kid from a small town in Ohio with a state school education and a chip on his shoulder the size of a building and turned him into the CEO of Hartwell Capital, a private equity firm with $400 million under management and a reputation for surgical, aggressive acquisitions. He was 43. He was handsome in the way that powerful men often are, not because the features are exceptional, but because confidence reshapes a face over time until it looks like it belongs to someone who has never been told no. His suits cost more than Sophia's monthly rent. He wore them like armor because they were. Tonight, the deal on the table was the Brandt Immobilien acquisition, a mid-sized Austrian real estate portfolio that would, if handled correctly, become the anchor of Hartwell Capital's European expansion. He had flown into Vienna that morning. The meeting had been arranged for 7. His interpreter, a freelance specialist named Klaus who had worked with Hartwell 3 times before, had sent a message at 6:49. Invoice for the Budapest engagement still unpaid. I'm afraid I can't proceed until the matter is resolved. Dominic had stared at the message for 10 full seconds. Then he had forwarded it to his assistant with 2 words, "Fix this," and walked into the dining room knowing he had 11 minutes and no one who could translate the document he hadn't fully read. He was not a man who panicked. He was a man who solved. He looked around the room, and his eyes landed on the waitress with the braid and the apron, and his brain did what brains do when they have been trained by a lifetime of hierarchy. It processed her uniform and her gender and her approximate age and the context of her presence, and it produced a conclusion, rapidly and with total confidence, about who she was and what she was capable of. He was wrong. He had no way of knowing how wrong, and that precisely was the point. Part 3. The document. His voice came across the dining room like something thrown. "Waitress, come here." Sophia set down the water pitcher. Slowly, the way her grandmother had taught her, when your hands want to shake, move slower, let stillness do what anger cannot. She crossed the floor and stopped in front of him. Up close, he was larger than she had registered from the service station. He held the document out, white pages, dense German text, the unmistakable formatting of a corporate acquisition agreement, with the casual authority of someone who has never had to wonder whether the person in front of them might say no. My interpreter walked out. "I need paragraph 4 translated. You're Austrian, yes. You people speak German." You people. Sophia let the phrase land without letting it show. She had gotten very good at that. "I can try," she said. His smile was the kind that invites the room to share in a joke. "Of course you can try. That's what you people do, isn't it?" He held the document higher. "Go on then. If you're so smart, translate it." Laughter or the edge of it from somewhere behind her. The particular uncomfortable almost laughter of people who know something is cruel but haven't yet decided whether to say so. Sophia took the document. She did not rush. She read the first sentence of paragraph 4, and something happened behind her eyes that had nothing to do with the restaurant around her, or the man standing over her, or the weight of being watched by a room full of strangers. Something shifted, focused, the way it had always focused when she read legal language, a kind of recognition, like hearing music in a language that bypasses the conscious mind and goes directly to understanding. She read the paragraph once, then again, because what she found required her to be certain, Paragraph 4 was not a standard dispute resolution clause. Paragraph 4 was a trap. Specifically, it was a jurisdictional transfer, buried in 3 sentences of dense German legalese, structured to read as boilerplate. That would, if signed, transfer all arbitration rights in any dispute arising from the acquisition to a Vienna Chamber of Commerce tribunal. Under Austrian corporate law, this meant that any challenge Hartwell Capital might bring regarding the valuation methodology, which, Sophia noticed immediately, was not independently verified anywhere in the document, would be heard in Vienna, under Austrian procedural rules, with Austrian legal representation, at Dominic Hartwell's expense. The sentence began with a phrase that looked like a standard governing law provision. It was not. It was architectural deception of the highest order, the work of a very good lawyer who had counted on this clause never being read carefully by the person signing it. Sophia looked up. The old man in the Tracton jacket, silver-haired, horn buttons, the kind of dignity that doesn't require announcement, had gone very still. His eyes were on her with an expression she would not understand until later. It looked almost impossibly like anticipation. She looked at Dominic. She made her decision. Paragraph 4, Sophia said, and her voice came out in the register she had used in courtrooms and depositions, the one her supervising judge had once described as the rare quality of making people want to stop and listen. Grants arbitration jurisdiction to the Vienna Chamber of Commerce in all disputes arising from this agreement. The room went still in a different way. This includes retroactively. That word, rückwirkend, is buried in the subordinate clause in the 3rd sentence, disputes related to the terms of the acquisition itself, not merely its execution. She placed the document on the table, in the center, not his side, not the other man's side, the center. Under Austrian corporate law, specifically Section 221 of the Unternehmensgesetzbuch, this means that any challenge you might bring regarding the valuation methodology used by Brandt Immobilien would be heard in Vienna, under Austrian procedural rules, at your expense. She folded her hands in front of her apron. The clause is grammatically structured to read as a routine governing law provision. It is not. It is a jurisdictional transfer with significant personal liability implications, embedded in a sentence designed to be skimmed. A pause, that's what paragraph 4 says. No one moved. Dominic Hartwell's face did something complicated. The color deepened and drained simultaneously, the physiological signature of a man whose body has registered danger before his mind has fully processed what just happened. Then the old man in the Tracton jacket made a sound, not quite a laugh. Something older and more complex than a laugh, something with a long memory in it. My name, he said, in English that carried the faintest trace of Vienna, is Heinrich Brandt. His eyes found Sophia's with the warmth of someone seeing a face they have been looking for. I believe we have met, Miss Brennan. 3 years ago, you reviewed the preliminary term sheet for the Salzburg waterfront development. For Mueller and Strauss. The dining room held its breath. I remember the memo you wrote, Heinrich said. 47 pages. The junior partners said it was the most thorough piece of contract analysis they had seen in a decade. Dominic's head turned toward the old man, then toward Sophia, then back. The motion had something of a man watching a room rearrange itself around him and being unable to locate the exit. You're a lawyer, he said. I was, Sophia said. I'm on leave. She is, Heinrich Brandt said pleasantly, one of the finest contract attorneys in Austria. She is also the person who just saved you from signing what would have been a catastrophically ill-advised document. He glanced toward the far end of the table, where one of the suited men had risen from his chair with the sharp, guilty movement of someone caught mid-plan. I discovered this clause this morning, Mr. Hartwell. My own legal team inserted it without my authorization. He looked at Sophia, and the relief on his face was genuine and unguarded, hoping someone would find it in time. Part 4. The Reckoning. What followed took 40 minutes and required the dining room to be cleared of everyone except Heinrich Brandt, Dominic Hartwell, Sophia, and eventually Garrett, Hartwell Capital's in-house counsel. A sharp-faced man who arrived with his tie already loosened, and his tablet already open, and who, upon being shown paragraph 4 and given Sophia's analysis, went through 4 visible stages of professional horror before settling into the focused grimness of a man doing triage. Sophia stood at the side of the table, still in her apron. No one suggested she change. No one suggested she might like to be somewhere else, because she was not done. She walked them through all 12 pages, systematically, with the precision of someone who had spent years doing exactly this, finding the fault lines in language that looks solid, locating the pressure points, mapping the architecture of what the document was actually designed to do versus what it claimed to do. She found 3 more provisions worth scrutiny. One regarding existing tenant leases that significantly advantaged the seller. One that defined material adverse chain in a way that would be nearly impossible for the buyer to invoke. And one gap, an absence rather than a presence, in the indemnification language where something critical had simply been left out. Not by accident. The suited man who had risen from the far table, one of Brandt's legal team, she now understood, had left the room by then, escorted out with the quiet efficiency of Heinrich's personal assistant, and the unspoken gravity of someone whose professional future had just been fundamentally renegotiated. Through all of it, Dominic Hartwell listened. This surprised her. She had categorized him quickly and confidently after he waved the document in her face. A particular kind of man, the kind who performs capability rather than exercises it, who has built an empire partly on talent and partly on the willingness to be in rooms where no one challenges him. She had been partly right, but she had also been wrong, because when she spoke he tracked. He asked at one point a question that stopped her, a precise, structurally sophisticated question about the interaction between the arbitration clause and an indemnification provision she had flagged. And she answered it, and he nodded once, and they moved forward, and she revised her categorization in real time the way good lawyers do. With the evidence in front of her, he was more than she had given him credit for. The arrogance was real. So was the intelligence. When it was finished, Heinrich Brandt stood, buttoned his jacket, and with the unhurried gravity of a man who has operated at the highest levels of European business for 50 years, he turned to Sophia. "What will it take," he said simply, "to have you back at a desk?" Part 5. What she said. She told him the truth. Not all of it. She was not built for all of it. Not here. Not in front of these men in this room, but the essential shape. The diagnosis, the cost, the leave that had become a life. The way 18 months of being invisible had a weight to it that she had stopped noticing because noticing it made it harder to carry. Heinrich listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Carl mentioned your situation." Carl was her former supervising partner. The fact that Heinrich Brandt knew Carl well enough to have had that conversation told her several things about the texture of this evening, about what had been arranged and what had been left to chance, and where exactly the boundary between the two was located. She would never ask him directly. Some things are better held as possibilities. "I have a proposal," Heinrich said, "but not tonight. Tonight has already been eventful enough." He left, and Sophia was alone in the private dining room with Dominic Hartwell, who was still seated, jacket off, the performance of the suit partially removed. Without it he looked older, more tired, more human. "I owe you an apology," he said. He said it without architecture. No cushioning, no preamble, no "I want you to know that I understand how this must have seemed" asterisk. Just the plain statement, offered plainly. Which is the only form of apology that means anything. You do, Sophia said. I'm offering one. I know. A silence that was not uncomfortable. How many conversations like tonight's have you listened to? He asked. In 18 months. In this room. She held his gaze. Many. Something moved through his face. The arithmetic of a man arriving at answers he should have done long ago, finding the numbers worse than expected. And you never said anything. It wasn't my place, she said, until you made it my place. He sat with that. Outside the tall windows, Vienna was doing what Vienna does at the blue hour, glowing amber and silver, the spires catching the last of the light, the city looking like a place where consequential things happen to people who are paying attention. What does she need? He asked. Your mother, what does she actually need? The question found a gap in her composure that the humiliation and the contract analysis and the full strange theater of the evening had not. Because it was not the question she expected. It had none of the transactional quality of the room around them. It was just a question, asked by a person to a person. She answered it honestly. And when she was finished, he told her about his father, how he had been in Tokyo when it happened, closing a deal, and hadn't made it back in time. He didn't ask her to do anything with the information. He just offered it. The way you offer something when you want a person to know you are not as far from their experience as your net worth suggests. When she finally walked toward the door, he said her name one more time. She stopped, didn't turn. For what it's worth, Dominic Hartwell said, I was wrong about everything I assumed when I looked at you. She stood in the doorway with the warm noise of the restaurant behind her and thought about all the things she could say. The sharp things. The things 18 months of invisibility had earned her the right to say. She thought about her grandmother instead, who had survived things that made this evening look like a rehearsal, who had taught her that the most devastating response to being underestimated is not punishment. It is to be so thoroughly, undeniably yourself, that the punishment administers itself in the privacy of the other person's reckoning. I know, she said, and she walked back into the restaurant where the dinner service was still running and the glasses still needed filling and everything, though no one could see it from the outside, had already irreversibly changed. Epilogue. 3 weeks later. The desk on the 14th floor of a building on the Ringstrasse had her name on a temporary contract and a permanent offer pending. The window looked out over Vienna's rooftops, not as backdrop, as reminder. The city spread below her like everything still possible. Heinrich Brandt's consultancy offer had been real and had been structured carefully enough that it was professional and not charity, even though it was also charity, and she had decided to let it be both without apology. The Hartwell-Brandt acquisition was being redrafted under her oversight, working with both legal teams to rebuild it from the ground up, clean, clear, unambiguous. A model, the senior partners were already saying, of how these documents should look. On her second day at the new desk, a courier delivered a package with no sender name. Inside, a first edition of a legal commentary she had referenced once, in passing, in her 47-page memo 3 years ago. The kind of book you only know to send if you have read the memo very carefully, multiple times, inside the front cover in handwriting she didn't recognize yet but would come to, I was wrong. Thank you for being right out loud. D. H. She set the book on her desk where the spine was visible, thought about putting it away, decided against it. Some reminders are worth keeping where you can see them, not as trophies, as calibration. Evidence that the story she had been telling herself, about temporary and invisible and later, when the conditions are right, was never the true one. The true story was always this. A woman who knew exactly what she was, waiting for the room that was ready to find out. Her mother was better that month than she had been in 6. Not well, the illness didn't permit well, not yet, but better. Reading again. Complaining about the television. Sophia's aunt said complaining was a reliable sign of returning spirit. Sophia called her every evening on the walk home. They talked about small things and sometimes large ones, the way illness strips away the noise that normally keeps the large things submerged. One evening her mother said, "Your grandmother would have wanted to see this." Sophia thought about a woman in a brown uniform standing in a private dining room with a contract in her hands, deciding, in 3 seconds, who she was going to be. "Yes," she said, "I think she would." She always said, her mother continued, carefully conserving, that the only difference between a woman who changes things and a woman who endures them is the moment she decides the enduring is finished. The lilacs outside her mother's window were open. Vienna smelled like spring and the particular stubborn hope of cities that have survived everything and remained. Sophia walked through it with her phone to her ear, and the 14th floor behind her, and the next morning ahead. The enduring was finished. The rest of the story was just beginning.